Good morning. Today is the 14th Sunday of church time. I want to begin talking about St. Paul. We know that St. Paul traveled all over preaching the gospel. And St. Paul's custom was first, St. Paul would arrive at a town and stay there and work and talk with people and preach and convince people about Jesus Christ. When he was done, St. Paul would leave and he would travel. And often, maybe 1-2 years after St. Paul had been to that town, St. Paul would send them a letter. However, St. Paul wrote a letter to the Roman Christian community. And it was a different letter. Why? St. Paul had not been to Rome, but the Romans had arrested St. Paul, tied him up, and then the Roman soldiers were going to bring St. Paul to Rome. The people in the Christian community in Rome had heard about Paul, but they didn't know him. So St. Paul decides to write a letter sort of explaining to that community his ideas about Jesus, his teachings, what he wanted to share with them. And we call that the letter to the Romans. It's interesting. During the months of this summer, for 5 weeks, the second reading each Sunday is from one chapter of that letter, chapter 8. Why? Because the Catholic Church feels that that one chapter is so important to help us not only understand what St. Paul was thinking, but to understand the meaning of St. Paul's teaching about Jesus Christ. And so this day is that first Sunday that we're starting to read chapter 8. And in that chapter, St. Paul talks about the Spirit of Jesus. And St. Paul says, if you have the Spirit of Jesus inside yourself, you're saved. But if you don't have the Spirit of Jesus in you, you're in a lot of trouble. What does that mean, the Spirit of Jesus? How do we understand that? And I think that the gospel for today really helps us understand the meaning of the Spirit of Jesus. In the gospel reading today, Jesus says, come. Come to me, all of you who've been struggling, all of you who just feels the burdens, the problems of life. Come to me. Why? Because I am meek and humble of heart, and you will find rest with me. That is the Spirit of Jesus, a spirit of welcome, a spirit of acceptance, a spirit of comfort and kindness, and patience and forgiveness and love. And so we are supposed to follow Jesus' teaching. If we want that same spirit in us, then we have to try to do exactly what Jesus tells us to do, to welcome people, to accept people, to be kind and patient and forgiving and loving. And I know right now, that's not an easy thing. Many of us are in our homes for long periods of time. We sit there and maybe we look at TV and sometimes we get really angry at what we see. I know I get angry sometimes at what I see and we start yelling at the TV or yelling at the radio. And I know the deaf, they sign to the TV because they're so upset. And we can become very kind of caught up with things in the world that upset us, that make us mad. And so it's really important to try to seek that Spirit of Jesus in our own hearts. And let me give you an example. This Monday, tomorrow, the church celebrates a special saint, a young woman named Maria Goretti. Now, many of you know the story. Maria grew up in a small town in Italy. When Maria was 12, a man came and tried to rape her, to force her to have sex with him. And Maria resisted. And that man became so angry, he started to stab her, to kill her. And Maria forgave him. Now, I've read that story, I've heard the story often. I think, how do you do that? How do you forgive a person who's actually stabbing and killing you at the same time? But Maria had that Spirit of Jesus in her heart, in her soul. And so a good way for us to think about, what is the Spirit of Jesus? Think about that young girl, that 12-year-old girl, who, even though she was so young and so innocent, had the Spirit of Jesus that helped her forgive the person who was killing her. Now, maybe we will never face a situation like that. I hope not. But we can always look at that example and ask the Lord to help us, to allow that Spirit of Jesus to live in us forever. Amen.